The Man-Eaters of Tsavo by J.H. Patterson. Chapter 3. The Attack on the Goods Wagon. All this time my own tent was pitched in an open clearing, unprotected by a fence of any kind round it. One night when the medical officer, Dr. Rose, was staying with me, we were awakened about midnight by hearing something tumbling about among the tent ropes, but on going out with the lantern we could discover nothing. Daylight, however, plainly revealed the pug marks of a lion, so that on that occasion I fancy one or other of us had a narrow escape. Warned by this experience, I at once arranged to move my quarters, and went to join forces with Dr. Brock, who had just arrived at Tsavo to take medical charge of the district. We shared a hut of palm leaves and boughs, which we had constructed on the eastern side of the river, close to the old caravan route leading to Uganda, and we had it surrounded by a circular boma, or thorn fence, about 70 yards in diameter, well made and thick and high. Our personal servants also lived within the enclosure, and a bright fire was always kept up throughout the night. For the sake of coolness, Brock and I used to sit out under the veranda of this hut in the evenings, but it was rather trying to our nerves to attempt to read or write there, as we never knew when a lion might spring over the boma, and be on us before we were awake. We therefore kept our rifles within easy reach, and cast many an anxious glance out into the inky darkness beyond the circle of the firelight. On one or two occasions we found in the morning that the lions had come quite close to the fence, but fortunately they never succeeded in getting through. By this time, too, the camps of the workmen had also been surrounded by thorn fences. Nevertheless, the lions managed to jump over or to break through some or other of these, and regularly every few nights a man was carried off, the reports of the disappearance of this or that workman coming in to me with painful frequency. So long, however, as Railhead Camp, with its 2,000 or 3,000 men scattered over a wide area, remained at Tsavo, the coolies appeared not to take much notice of the dreadful deaths of their comrades. Each man felt, I suppose, that as the man-eaters had a large number of victims to choose from, the chances of their selecting him in particular was very small. But when the large camp moved ahead with the railway, matters altered considerably. I was then left with only some few hundred to complete the permanent works, and as all the remaining workmen were naturally camped together, the attentions of the lions became more apparent and made a deeper impression. A regular panic consequently ensued, and it required all my powers of persuasion to induce the men to stay on. In fact, I succeeded in doing so only by allowing them to knock off all regular work until they had built exceptionally thick and high bomas round each camp. Within these enclosures fires were kept burning all night, and it was also the duty of the night watchman to keep clattering 6 empty oil tins suspended from a convenient tree. These he manipulated by means of a long rope, while sitting in safety within his tent, and the frightful noise thus produced was kept up at frequent intervals during the night, in the hopes of terrifying away the man-eaters. In spite of all these precautions, however, the lions would not be denied, and men continued to disappear. When the railhead workmen moved on, their hospital camp was left behind. It stood rather apart from the other camps, in a clearing about 3/4 of a mile from my hut, but was protected by a good thick fence, and to all appearance was quite secure. It seemed, however, as if barriers were of no avail against the demons, for before very long one of them found a weak spot in the boma and broke through. On this occasion the hospital assistant had a marvelous escape. Hearing a noise outside, he opened the door of his tent and was horrified to see a great lion standing a few yards away looking at him. The beast made a spring towards him, which gave the assistant such a fright that he jumped backwards, and in doing so luckily upset a box containing medical stores. This crashed down with such a loud clatter of breaking glass that the lion was startled for the moment, and made off to another part of the enclosure. Here, unfortunately, he was more successful, as he jumped onto and broke through a tent in which 8 patients were lying. 2 of them were badly wounded by his spring, while a third poor wretch was seized and dragged off bodily through the thorn fence. The 2 wounded coolies were left where they lay, a piece of torn tent having fallen over them, and in this position the doctor and I found them on our arrival after dawn next morning. We at once decided to move the hospital closer to the main camp, A fresh site was prepared, a stout hedge built round the enclosure, and all the patients were moved in before nightfall. As I had heard that lions generally visit recently deserted camps, I decided to sit up all night in the vacated boma in hope of getting an opportunity of bagging one of them. But in the middle of my lonely vigil, I had the mortification of hearing shrieks and cries coming from the direction of the new hospital, telling me only too plainly that our dreaded foes had once more eluded me. Hurrying to the place at daylight, I found that one of the lions had jumped over the newly erected fence and had carried off the hospital bishti, water carrier, and that several other coolies had been unwilling witnesses of the terrible scene which took place within the circle of light given by the big campfire. The bishti, it appears, had been lying on the floor, with his head towards the center of the tent and his feet neatly touching the side. The lion managed to get his head in below the canvas, seized him by the foot, and pulled him out. In desperation, the unfortunate water carrier clutched hold of a heavy box in a vain attempt to prevent himself being carried off, and dragged it with him until he was forced to let go by its being stopped by the side of the tent. He then caught hold of a tent rope, and clung tightly to it until it broke. As soon as the lion managed to get him clear of the tent, he sprang at his throat, and after a few vicious shakes, the poor bishti's agonizing cries were silenced forever. The brute then seized him in his mouth, like a huge cat with a mouse, and ran up and down the boma looking for a weak spot to break through. This he presently found and plunged into, dragging his victim with him, and leaving the shreds of torn cloth and flesh as ghastly evidences of his passage through the thorns. Dr. Brock and I were easily able to follow his track, and soon found the remains about 400 yards away in the bush. There was the usual horrible sight. Very little was left of the unfortunate bishti, only the skull, the jaws, a few of the larger bones, and a portion of the palm with 1 or 2 fingers attached. On one of these was a silver ring, and this, with the teeth, a relic much prized by certain castes, was sent to the man's widow in India. Again it was decided to move the hospital, and again, before nightfall, the work was completed, including a still stronger and thicker boma. When the patients had been moved, I had a covered goods wagon placed in a favorable position, on a siding which ran close to the site which had just been abandoned, and in this Brock and I arranged to sit up that night. We left a couple of tents still standing within the enclosure, and also tied up a few cattle in it as bait for the lions, who had been seen in no less than 3 different places in the neighborhood during the afternoon, April 23rd. 4 miles from Tsavo, they had attempted to seize a coolie who was walking along the line. Fortunately, however, he had just time to escape up a tree, where he remained, more dead than alive, until he was rescued by the traffic manager, who caught sight of him from a passing train. They next appeared close to Tsavo Station, and a couple of hours later some workmen saw one of the lions stalking Dr. Brock as he was returning about dusk from the hospital. In accordance with our plan, the doctor and I set out after dinner for the goods wagon, which was about a mile away from our hut. In the light of the subsequent events, we did a very foolish thing in taking up our position so late. Nevertheless, we reached our destination in safety and settled down to our watch about 10 o'clock. We had the lower half of the door of the wagon closed, while the upper half was left wide open for observation, and we faced, of course, in the direction of the abandoned boma, which, however, we were unable to see in the inky darkness. For an hour or 2 everything was quiet, and the deadly silence was becoming very monotonous and oppressive, when suddenly, to our right, a dry twig snapped, and we knew that an animal of some sort was about. Soon afterwards we heard a dull thud, as if some heavy body had jumped over the boma. The cattle, too, became very uneasy, and we could hear them moving about restlessly. Then again came dead silence. At this junction I proposed to my companion that I should get out of the wagon and lie on the ground close to it, as I could see better in that position should the lion come in our direction with its prey. Brock, however, persuaded me to remain where I was, and a few seconds afterwards I was heartily glad that I had taken his advice, for at that very moment one of the man-eaters, although we did not know it, was quietly stalking us, and was even then almost within springing distance. Orders had been given for the entrance to the boma to be blocked up, and accordingly We were listening in the expectation of hearing the lion force his way out through the bushes with his prey. As a matter of fact, however, the doorway had not been properly closed, and while we were wondering what the lion could be doing inside the boma for so long, he was outside all the time, silently reconnoitering our position. Presently I fancied I saw something coming very stealthily towards us. I feared, however, to trust to my eyes, which by that time were strained by prolonged staring through the darkness, so under my breath I asked Brock whether he saw anything, at the same time covering the dark object as well as I could with my rifle. Brock did not answer. He told me afterwards that he, too, thought he had seen something move, but was afraid to say so lest I should fire and it turn out to be nothing after all. After this there was intense silence again for a second or two. Then with a sudden bound a huge body sprang at us. "The lion!" I shouted. We both fired almost simultaneously. Not a moment too soon, for in another second the brute would surely have landed inside the wagon. As it was, he must have swerved off in his spring, probably blinded by the flash and frightened by the noise of the double report, which was increased 100-fold by the reverberation of the hollow iron roof of the truck. Had we not been very much on the alert, he would undoubtedly have got one of us, and we realized that we had a very lucky and very narrow escape. The next morning we found Brock's bullet embedded in the sand close to a footprint. It could not have missed the lion by more than an inch or two. Mine was nowhere to be found. Thus ended my first direct encounter with one of the man-eaters.